Hey, do you want to hear one more person talk about the New York Times best books of the 21st century list? Of course you do. You're here. And if this is your first time here, hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. Reviews, wrap-ups, adaptation opinions, anticipated releases, general thoughts and ramblings. So if any of that sounds good to you, you should stick around and maybe even subscribe, like, comment as you see fit. But today we are falling under the kind of general ramblings umbrella in talking about this list that came out of the New York Times, and this is going to be a kind of casual conversation in the style maybe even of some of the Goodreads Choice Award videos when we get to that at the end of the year, just kind of looking at this list and also just looking at this list for what it is and acknowledging that what it is mainly, in my interpretation, is an effort to drive engagement, because they are framing this as the best books of the 21st century so far in the first 25 years. Now, maybe I am just too far on the side of the spectrum that's the kind of person that won't even release my best books of the year until January, just in case one sneaks in at the end of December. But we are still in the middle of 2024, and we conceivably started the process of gathering these titles much earlier in the year. So we are not even technically 25 years into the century quite yet, which tells me that this is a drive for engagement, and the way that we as readers can interact with the article also supports that, in that we can get these nice graphics of how many in the list we've read or how many we want to read, though we have to take like a screenshot of it and edit it down. They don't have it where it's a nice easy share, which I do think limits that possibility in terms of the engagement as well, but it's a nice effort. But I do think that it is a very interesting list. Now, as always, these lists are always subjective, and I always go in under the assumption that it is going to skew toward a specific kind of lit fic, which I do think this does still to a certain extent, but I was really pleasantly surprised to see a lot more speculative fiction on the list than I expected. That being said, we don't, with the exception maybe of, spoiler alert, N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, and the kind of caveat that any of the books I haven't read could also fall under this umbrella, we don't really see a whole lot of things that would be considered genre fiction more traditionally. And so we still are, even in the kind of odd speculative-esque fiction that makes the list, it is still things that kind of straddle that line and still falls within like literary fiction or popular literature more generally, as well as having those elements of the speculative or the genre. So there is definitely a skew to the list, as there's always going to be a skew to any list, which is additionally interesting because they did, according to the article, have this list voted on by, as they say, 503 novelists, nonfiction writers, poets, critics, and other book lovers, with the help of the staff from the New York Times Book Review. I do have a question about how much help from the staff of the New York Times Book Review, just in terms of the editing of this list, which I think could have had a heavier hand, in that we see multiple repeat authors on this list, which is not taking away from those authors, their work and their success, but I think that there are so many great books that have come out in the last 25 years. There has been a lot of work produced in the last 25 years. Anecdotally, it feels like we've really ramped up production of books, but I can only speak to my own life experience, and also the way that book discovery works has drastically changed in the age of the internet and especially social media. So that's not really a fair comparison, especially when my prime reading years do fall within the span of this list, because I was not expecting to see such seminal works as Captain Underpants or Artemis Fowl make the list. And now thinking about that a little deeper, those probably would have come out in the 90s, and so not even qualified for the list, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. Children's literature never really had a hope of making this list, which is a bummer because we've had some really stellar books for young people in the last quarter century. Just off the top of my head, with no shade to those titles and authors that aren't right at the top of my head, things like Brown Girl Dreaming from Jacqueline Woodson or The Girl Who Drank the Moon from Kelly Barnhill, really excellent works that have come out of especially the middle grade space, but some really great young adult work as well within the last 25 years, especially as the last 25 years really represents the height of YA. So I don't have an issue with the methodology per se, especially as something like this is always going to be incredibly subjective. And I also think that pulling from a larger group of readers and writers helped make this list more diverse in a myriad of ways. But I also think that there could have been a heavier editing hand in allowing more authors and more books that deserved a spot on here too a chance to shine. It's also interesting and of note to me that within the introduction to the article itself, to the list itself, they're talking about this methodology or introducing this methodology to an abridged extent, but they list some of those authors that they pulled individually, probably because I do think that a lot of these authors had their ballots kind of featured as well. However, they specifically mentioned Sarah MacLean, who, if you have been here for any length of time, you know that I love quite a lot as a romance author, and it's also of note that she is one of the biggest voices, not only in historical romance or romance in general, but she has a very successful podcast, Fated Mates, in which she talks about romance, and she is a huge advocate of the genre more generally, and she is very knowledgeable in the genre. And so she submitted, because I saw it on her Instagram, a ballot of all romances with excellent picks, at least of the ones that I have read from her ballot. And we don't see any genre, let alone romance, really on this list substantially. So I found it interesting that they're using really popular genre names like Sarah MacLean to help bolster the engagement of this list without substantially really recognizing the type of work that these authors produce and promote more generally. So it's just of interest. And again, knowing that this is a very subjective list, I'm never going into a list like this, unfortunately, really expecting there to be a whole lot of genre fiction represented. And that's a real shame, because I think we've seen some excellent genre fiction out of the last 25 years. And I think we've seen a lot of blending and crossing of genre lines across the board, which I do think we get recognition of here to a certain extent, because I think there is some really interesting work that veers more into the speculative realm than I honestly went into this list expecting, even if these are undoubtedly, I think, some of the best titles of the last 25 years from my own personal perspective, and the caveat being that I already kind of lean in that direction in my fiction. So with all of that being said, I kind of want to just go through some of these titles, especially or particularly the titles that I have read. I have read 23 titles from this list, which I was a little ashamed by at first, because that is not as high as I would like it to be. But I have to recognize, again, the specific kind of books often that are being pulled from this list. And also, while these are coming from my prime reading years, I was not reading the type of literary fiction or nonfiction that is most likely to end up on a list like this prior to, I want to say, probably like 2010. There are books from before that that I have read or make it on, but I wasn't reading like the hottest new literary fiction releases in like 2005. I was reading Karen Marie Moning and Julie Garwood and Meg Cabot. So I had a different perspective at that time. But I do want to talk about some of these books, some of the books that I would like to read from this list yet, maybe, though I'm not going to go through all of those specifically, and some of the books I was actually surprised not to see on the list. So like I said, as we go through all of this, it's going to be very conversational. I'm not going to just read off the list to you, though I will link it below, but I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about this list more generally, how many books from the list you've read, if you were surprised by any inclusions or exclusions from the list, and feel free, of course, to disagree with anything I say about these books or my opinions more generally. Now, the first book I read from the list comes in at 95 and is Hilary Mantel's Bring Up the Bodies, which is the second in her Wolf Hall trilogy, which we will see come back around, and was the second time that she won the Man Booker for this trilogy. And this was also a time where I was very in to the Man Booker, or the kind of start of that. I've really fallen off in the last couple of years. But this series came out when I was in college, because I remember bonding with one of my professors over really loving it. And Bring Up the Bodies, I was actually shocked to see this low when I realized that Wolf Hall is later on the list, which I guess we can talk about it in context. But I believe that Bring Up the Bodies is the strongest book of the trilogy. And it may be that it has the benefit of being the most dramatically interesting from the historical period it's covering. For those who don't know, the Wolf Hall trilogy is following Thomas Cromwell in the court of King Henry VIII. And it is very distinctive in its narrative stylings, in that it uses what I have colloquially called over the last however many years extreme third person. And I think that this was actually perfected as a narrative style in Bring Up the Bodies. Now, it may just be that by that point I was used to it. It was characters I was more familiar with, or happenings that I was more familiar with, because this book really was following the fall of Anne Boleyn and the rise of Jane Seymour within the court of Henry VIII, but from, of course, Cromwell's perspective. But I just thought it worked the best. Now, I will say the only book from this trilogy I actually own is the last one, The Mirror and the Light, which did not make the list and is the only one from the trilogy that did not win the Man Booker, and I do understand why. It had a lot to kind of wrap up. It was a lot slower and bulkier, I would argue, than the other 3 or 2 books, though I still did really enjoy it. And I do want to just read this passage from the book that I marked at the time it came out, because it is speaking to the political time within the book, but also how that political time is speaking to now, which I think has become an even greater strength of this series, unfortunately, as the kind of historical record has risen to meet the occurrences of the book. But this is also just a kind of hint of the voice of the entire trilogy. It says, "It takes a generation," he says, "to reconcile heads and hearts. Englishmen of every shire are wedded to what their nurses told them. They do not like to think too hard or disturb the plan of the world that exists inside their heads, and they will not accept change unless it puts them in better ease. But new times are coming." So just the kind of inevitability of things, especially knowing the end of Cromwell's story as a reader. And this book in particular, the last one, even though I know we are talking about Bring Up the Bodies right now, is a lot more philosophical, because we are moving in that point of Cromwell and knowing the inevitable fall of Cromwell. But Bring Up the Bodies is watching Cromwell help orchestrate the fall of Anne Boleyn. And so it directly feeds into the repercussions of the 3rd book, but it is just such a stunning trilogy. I know there are play versions of it as well, and has it been filmed? I do not remember. I need to get a hold of it, but I really loved this trilogy. And it's interesting because I do think it's one of those things where, thinking about it translating in an adaptation, that the voice is so singular in this work. Again, that extreme third person is such a huge part of the reading experience. It's not just the story or the uniqueness of this story being told from Cromwell's perspective in particular, especially for readers who are more familiar with Tudor fiction more generally, but it's the whole package. And with that of note as well, I am so grateful that we did get the final book in this trilogy before Hilary Mantel's passing, and I think more often than I probably should about all of the work that we will never get from Mantel because of her passing. So that was a huge loss to the literary community, to my assessment, but I am so grateful that we have this trilogy and that it is getting the recognition that it really deserves. You know, not that it didn't at the time with 2 Man Booker Awards, which I think is a huge feat to be noted in and of itself, despite the fact that I don't really think that authors should repeat on this list, but that's just my own opinion. And then the next book that I have read is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, I have reread bits and pieces of this more recently. I didn't get through my reread in attempting or desiring to watch the TV show, and I actually have not watched the show. I know that there were a lot of changes made to that. I'm very interested in those changes. I know that we spent a lot more time in Chicago in the show than we ever do in the book, and that should be a draw for me as a person who lives in Chicago. But this book has been very special to me since it was published. When did it come out? It came out, I want to say 2013, 2014. Not 13, 14. Where is the dang copyright page? Find it someday. 2014. This was the year right after I was out of college. So I spent a year I spent the summer after graduating college in May of 2013 in Chicago at the Goodman. And then I spent a year after that, or almost a year, in Cleveland at Cleveland Playhouse. And immediately after coming back from Cleveland Playhouse, I spent some time at home before coming back to Chicago. And I just remember this being a particularly fruitful time in my reading life and discovering just so many wonderful books. I do have the rise of book blogs at the time, and in particular Book Riot as a huge contributor to that, but this was one of the books I discovered in that time. And this lives in the same time as things like The Bone Clocks and All the Light We Cannot See. And I have this thing where sometimes I can remember where I was reading a book more distinctly than some of the things in the book, which is a problem, but this is a book that I was reading as a substitute teacher, so I could remember reading it on like breaks where kids were at specials, or it was a prep period. This was also a period where I was reading a lot of books through the library on my iPad or through ARCs on my iPad, and that is a time that I will probably never travel back to because of my eyes, but I really just love remembering the time of falling in love with this book as well as the book itself. The language, again, is lyrical and gorgeous. It does venture into the realm of kind of sci-fi elements. It's dystopian, but not in the way that we were thinking about dystopias at the time in relation to kind of like the young adult landscape. It opens with this really haunting kind of foreshadow of a production of King Lear that just works so well in its descriptions, and the descriptions throughout really continue to bolster this book. I remember picking it up because I did see it in Book Riot. Book Riot was a huge influence on my reading life at the time in a great way because I discovered so many wonderful reads, but I remember thinking that there was going to be much more of a cult angle in this than there was because of course I was interested in cults even back then. And I will say how it's interesting that like misconceptions like that can stay with you even amidst loving the book. But yeah, not at all surprised to see this book on the list. The next book I've read from the list is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, which I have a video discussing with my friend Katie from the first Trans Rights Readathon, and it is a book that I did eventually finish because I was shamefully not all the way through the book in the midst of that discussion, but I was more interested going into that discussion and hearing what Katie had to say about the book anyway, so I am okay with that. But the book really is a feat in that it is unafraid, it is raw, and it is looking at the trans experience in a way that, to my conversation with Katie in particular, really resonates with the trans community and is really written for the trans community to my kind of view of the book. One of those instances in which the specificity helps it appeal more broadly, I would say, but also I think one of the big parts of the appeal of the book is just how unapologetic the characters are. They are full, complete, flawed people that we can recognize as human beings in the sense that they're messy and they're not these just kind of perfect representations of a person or a moral dilemma in whatever context. And all of that helps the book to feel more intimate as well, and it just works. And then a book I haven't read but is notable because it is the third entry for this author on the list, and the only of this author's entries on the list I have not read, and I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation of this, Pastoralia by George Saunders. I've read We'll Get To, 10th of December, and Lincoln in the Bardo, and I've read his most recent collection of short stories. This is an additional collection of short stories, and honestly, I don't think that this should have been included in the list. Now, granted, I have not read it, and I'm not questioning how beautiful, interesting, weird these stories are coming from Saunders, but between this and 10th of December, it is the, I think, lesser known short story collection, and I don't know why we need two of his short story collections on the list when he has 3 entries additionally. And again, I love George Saunders. It is not a knock on George Saunders, but it has also been a second since I've read 10th of December, so if you want to make an argument for Pastoralia, I know that that is incorrect, over 10th of December, feel free to argue your case, but it's also the lesser read of the two, which again, I know popularity doesn't equal better, But again, I just don't know that we need both of them on the list. Next in the books that I've read, we have An American Marriage by T.R.E. Jones that came out in 2018 and follows a couple through a wrongful conviction of the husband, and is just a very intimate look at what incarceration wreaks in terms of individuals and personal relationships and community. But it is also a look at racism, especially considering the kind of assault that this man, as a black man, was accused of wrongfully, in a way that mirrors a lot of wrongful accusations at the height of Jim Crow, and looking at how we have not come as far as we think we've come in that regard. Now, it's been a second since I've read this book, and I don't remember all of the intricacies and nuance as in-depth as I would like to be able to discuss it, but I definitely think it is an important book and a book that sparks conversation, especially amidst the modern American canon. Next, among the more recent entries on the list, we have Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which I would argue is the most accessible in terms of her body of work for a list like this. The storied life of A.J. Fikry could be shoved into the corner of women's fiction a little bit more, even if I absolutely disagree with that assessment and the kind of speaking down to women's fiction. But this book just has a bit more mass appeal. Now, I know there are very strong reactions to this book from either side. People either really, really love it or they really, really hated it. I do not think it was a perfect book, and I've obviously had a couple of years to sit with it. I did do a Feature Friday on it back in 2022. For my kind of initial, much more succinct thoughts about the book, I wrote lots of thoughts. This drug a little bit in the middle for me as the time jump started to make me feel disconnected from the characters' internal journeys, and this was a very internal, interpersonal story with only peripheral references to the larger world success. However, the last fourth of the book also made it clear why that was necessary. There were some things in this that I thought happened very suddenly. There were some handling of characters in some instances that maybe weren't as nuanced or fair to that character as other characters in the book, but at the same time, in this book, we really were focused on Sam and Sadie, and as much as anything, this really was a character study. So while it is also a love letter to video games in many ways, we were incredibly focused on these two characters, and they were driving everything, as evidenced by a lot of the time jumps in the narrative. And it got experimental mostly toward the end in the form of storytelling and using video games as a device in which to help tell some of the story, especially when the characters became incredibly emotionally detached through a kind of Oregon Trail-esque RPG that was really interesting to see play out. And it was also interesting because that was the most experimental portion of the book, and there was opportunity to be more experimental throughout, I think. However, I think it was just experimental enough to appeal to readers like me who like that really experimental, odd form of storytelling, but also still remain appealing to a wider, more popular audience. Additionally, it has the kind of look at video games and video game history as the backdrop for this, which hits at a time where a lot of adult readers grew up with video games or have a lot of emotional attachment to video games. And so referencing video games and using video games as a kind of framing device for different emotional epics within these characters' journeys, I think really speaks to readers in the current moment, and is also just really inventive storytelling in terms of thinking about these video games as forms of storytelling as well. And so I do think that there is a lot going on with this book. I will be interested to see how the conversation around the book continues to evolve as we get more distance from it. Like, will it have more of the lasting power of some of these other books that we've seen in the list? Like, will it have the lasting power of something like Station 11 that has been around for a decade now, which does hurt to say out loud, but is the truth? But I will definitely be very interested to see culturally how we continue to react and respond to that work over the years in the way that, and I guess this is kind of foreshadowing to some of the discussion of things that maybe aren't on the list, but if it had been just a couple of years after Hana Yanagihara's A Little Life came out, I think that there would have been a very real shot at seeing that on this list. But I think that a lot of the really valid cultural critique and conversation we've had around that novel since it came out is the reason why we don't see it on this this list, and I honestly do not miss it necessarily on this list by any means. And so I'm very interested too in how our reception to work evolves over the years and with time, and what will last within the greater cultural consciousness and what won't, even to the point of some of the books that appear on the list from earlier in the century, closer to the dawn of the new millennium, that I as a reader just don't have as much of a sense of because they came out when I was like a preteen or a teenager and were never appealing in the way that I swung back to them. Now, there are also some that I'm very much aware of and do want to swing back to at some point, but have always just kind of existed on the liminal TBR, as is life. Next on the list at 75, a book I was pleased but not surprised to see, Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, which came out in 2017. Kind of close. I would have been looking at it around the same time. This was an excellent book. I need to revisit it, especially I think within the current moment, but beautiful. All of the booksellers I knew at the time who read it loved it. I wish I had more to say about it. It follows a couple whose love story is shaken amidst civil unrest and the inevitable discovery of doors that open to other places, and then their lives as refugees. But the language in here is just gorgeous and specific, and yeah, I need to revisit this book for sure. Next we have The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai, which is also somewhat recent comparatively. It came out in 2019. This takes place in 1985 in Chicago amidst the height of the AIDS epidemic, and then it's also following 30 years later, where one of the women from this friend group is trying to track down her estranged daughter, who is kind of caught up in a cult or cult adjacent. I remember going to a discussion between Rebecca Makkai, because she is one of the best moderators of book discussions in Chicago, and she was in conversation with R.O. Kwon, whose book The Incendiaries came out the same year, and so they were both discussing the kind of cult adjacent angles in their books without, I believe on Rebecca Mackai's case, she was basing this on a specific cult that to my knowledge she has never named to prevent potential litigation, I believe, but that is an angle in the book, and an angle I went in expecting to be the thing that drew me to the book, or the reason I kept reading. And I'm gonna try and get through this without getting too emotional, because this book does make me emotional, but just the intense character study of these characters, especially within the 1980s plotline, and the kind of reality that we know that these communities are going to be staring down amidst the historical realities of this time. Reading this in Chicago, knowing these places, having so many friends in the queer community in Chicago today, I would go out for walks amidst reading this book, after reading this book. Sometimes it still kind of floats across my mind while out and about, and just kind of feel the specters and feel the ghosts related to this story, and just thinking about all that we lost in this generation. So yeah, not to get too heavy about it, but it is brilliantly and beautifully told. I did have some reservations when I first read it about Makkai being the person to tell this story, but it has been handled with such care. I have seen it received by the communities this story represents well, and I just think that it is her best work. I have also read I Have Some Questions for You, The Borrower, and her short story collection Music for Wartime, which I admittedly really have no recollection of, but this is the book that is going to stick with me. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, I have not read, I know is more recent and has gotten a ton of great buzz. Now, this is a retelling of David Copperfield, which was actually my first Dickens, and I still have a lot of love for. I've considered going back and rereading within the last couple of years because I don't have it as strongly in my head as I used to. And this is a modern Appalachian, sorry Kate if I butchered that, retelling of David Copperfield, which I do think makes a lot of sense in terms of modern transposition of that story, and yet I remain disappointed that this is not actually a David Copperfield retelling with demons, and maybe that is an illustration of why I have not read more of the books on this list, despite considering or liking to consider myself a very well-read person. And yes, I do recognize that I also expressed this disappointment when talking about Demon Copperhead back when it came out in an anticipated release video, so at least I'm consistent. Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides I have not read, and I've heard some kind of legitimate critique about. However, I would like to take this opportunity to complain about Jeffrey Eugenides' The Marriage Plot for just a second, which I know is a detour and we have a lot to talk about. However, when The Marriage Plot came out, it was lauded, or at least it felt like it was lauded. And granted, again, it was a different time, and it was also really riding on the success of Middlesex. But The Marriage Plot would have been categorized as women's fiction if it was coming out in the same era by any female author. And it felt like, to my recollection, to be fair, it fundamentally kind of misunderstood the marriage plot of the 19th century novel. It wanted to be in conversation with the marriage plot without really understanding the stakes of the marriage plot and really the appeal of the marriage plot. And I just think it was a missed opportunity for another author to have explored that with more sincerity and with more success. And I just got the sense as I was reading it that this man thought that he was smarter and better than the subject material that was being explored. So anyway, Middlesex is not on my TBR. The next book I actually read, we've talked about briefly already, 10th of December by George Saunders. I don't have a whole lot more to really add about this short story collection in particular because I don't really remember any of the stories in particular. Is this the one where it's got women like hanging on the clothesline? He's got this thing, his stories are so odd, and you know that appeals to me, so I really do like his short stories. If this is the collection that has that story, it does make me think of a short story, or I think the short story that opens his latest short story collection, Liberation Day, and there is a certain amount of like trust the process in these stories. In that story, I remember really being kind of confused as I was going through. It took me a bit to catch up with what was going on, but he was leading me very specifically to those revelations. And again, there is just an oddity and a dark humor to these stories. And so if you are like me and you like the dark and the weird and occasionally the humorous in your short stories, I do think that this is something that you should pick up. Again, should it really be on this list? I don't know, in that I do know how I feel because I have very strong feelings about which George Saunders should be on this list, but we will get to that shortly. However, moving on, next in terms of books that are still on my TBR, I have Trust by Hernan Diaz, was it the Man Booker that this won? What did this win? The Pulitzer? The Pulitzer. This and Demon Copperhead both won the same year, and so it is nice to see that they are both represented on this list as well, because it would have been kind of weird to see one versus the other, but I still very much intend to read this book, and I actually went and bought this after the awards were announced and specifically did not buy the other. I was in the bookstore at the same time as other people were coming in looking for the Demon Copperhead, so we both had our kind of focus in terms of what was appealing to us in relation to what had won awards, but I also still need to very much read this book. And with that, we are halfway through the list, and hopefully I will speed this up. Next we have The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which to my recollection of the list holistically is the most kind of horror we get on the list, and this also makes sense to me. This book was incredibly popular when it came out. It was everywhere at the time, and it's horror, but also horror that is social commentary. And to be fair, a lot of horror, especially good horror, also has elements of social commentary, but it's weird and dark and a kind of experimental philosophical horror that I think blends across genre lines really easily and successfully. And it's got a feminist angle to it while also being an insightful look at Korean culture and relationships, and I just think that it really holds up. Now granted, I haven't read it recently, but I do think it was a kind of harbinger to the kind of horror we would see the genre shifting to and the kinds of things that I am really responding to within my own reading life. So in that way, I am very grateful to it. Next we have Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which I didn't count the first time I went through the list because I have personally only read Persepolis, not the complete Persepolis, but they are only only showing Persepolis, so I'm going to count it. Now, I did read this, I want to say around high school or maybe early college, so I don't have as deep a recollection of this as I wish I did. It is a graphic novel, and I remember really, really enjoying it, and it being a great introduction to graphic novels for me at the time as someone who didn't really read graphic novels. And even now, it's not my most consumed medium by any stretch, but I think that this was a really great introduction to the form for me, and I remember really responding to this graphic novel. Next is A Mercy by Toni Morrison, which I read in 2016 and don't remember as distinctly as I wish I did. I really need to go back and revisit because Toni Morrison is not arguably one of the best voices in the American literary canon. And I don't know, is this her only release within the 21st century? I'm not sure. It is a very short book to my remembrance, and while I have not read Morrison's complete canon, this, to my reading experience, read a little bit more as focused historical fiction than some of her other work has. Now, it still has her incredibly distinctive voice, the fluidity, the lyricism, and the poetry, and the real exploration across time in a lot of ways, but the story does feel a little bit more centralized within that historical setting to my recollection. Now, again, her other books have historical settings as well. I don't know how to fully articulate the difference in lens I'm seeing there, but of course this is going to make the list as a Toni Morrison because her craft is just that strong. The idea that it wouldn't make the list is kind of absurd. And then we have The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. It's very interesting because I read this book when it came out, and it was a year of really chunky novels. This book and The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton both came out in the same year and were very hyped. So it's very interesting to see which of the two has kind of enjoyed more longevity in terms of the book. Now, to my knowledge, both had adaptations for the screen in whatever variety that didn't do so well, but it's interesting looking back because I remember being really enamored of this book when I first read it. I thought that I was very smart and up on the literary moment, but it hasn't stuck with me in any way where I feel compelled to revisit it. And looking back, I wonder and lean toward the opinion that maybe it's a little bloated, which is kind of ironic because it looks like Stephen King voted for this book according to the articles, so that kind of makes sense. I'm not completely writing it off because it's been so long since I've read it. And to my memory, it did have some really beautiful sentences, but I wonder now how many of those sentences were kind of purple in execution. And again, I am not above a purple prose, so I might revisit it and still really love it. But I don't know. I don't know how much of my recollection of this book is kind of the hype and the feat of having completed the book. Looking back, I did give it 5 stars, but I didn't write anything else, so I don't really have a sense of where my head was at the time. And I'm not above kind of reassessing my response to a book or acknowledging that my response to a book is going to be different at different points in my life. But it's very interesting to kind of look back and see my reaction then so strongly positive and becoming more ambivalent in my recollection of the book as I get older. So I just don't know if I would have the same response. But then next we have The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which, as I said before, to my kind of assessment of the list, is the most kind of genre leaning we get in this list. Now, The Fifth Season is an incredibly award-winning and well-received book for good reason. Now, before our kind of disbanding, I had a book club of a group of still very close friends, and the one thing we could generally always agree on was N.K. Jemisin. I say generally because I do remember some really robust discussion about which of the stories in her collection, How Long Till Black Future Month, was actually the best, because we all had very specific opinions on which were our favorite. And I will admit that I am behind in that I do need to both finish this series and swing back and read Jemisin's other work, including her duology that I own. Both. I own the first one at least. It was pre-ordered. But this book is such a feat in terms of storytelling and form. It is so inventive and interesting, and I'm saying this as someone who doesn't gravitate toward dystopias. We did have a rather robust discussion about this book as well, but that involved logistics regarding intimate acts engaged in by characters within the book and the health, repercussions of such acts, potential, theoretical. I'm not going to get into that here, but this was just such an interesting book, and I do need to reread this before finishing the trilogy because I need to reintroduce myself to the world and the storytelling and the characters. But I remember this just being so much fun and such a delight, and I am so excited to see something that is so inventive and also that really does fall firmly within the genre categorization in this list. Next, I have not read A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James, and I don't know if I'm going to swing back, but what I do need to do is reread Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and then finally read the second in the trilogy, and I don't think the third is out yet, but just kind of reintroduce myself to that world and the storytelling in there, which is incredibly inventive and interesting. And I know that that form of storytelling is also evident in this book. I did have a friend when I was a bookseller read it and really enjoy it and talk about the kind of form of storytelling. I also just, if you have not listened to the podcast with Marlon James and his editor, it's called Marlon and Jake Read Dead People. Just give that a try because it was an utter delight. And back in the beginning of 2020, before certain world events, I was listening to it constantly at work, in that I listened to like all the episodes there were in like a day. Next is H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald, which is a memoir that recalls Macdonald getting into hawking and her relationship with her hawk in the grief after the loss of her father and that relationship. And it was such a specific narrative and book, and the language was so lyrical that it took me until like halfway through, as someone who likes to consider themselves pretty smart, to realize that it was in fact a memoir, that it wasn't a novel. Part of this I also do chalk up to the cover art, which at the time especially was something that you would have seen on a novel more than nonfiction or memoir, but it really was gorgeous. Next, expectedly, only unexpected in that it is actually further down the list than I think we would have seen it if this list had come out earlier, though to be fair, there were less books if the list had come out earlier, but A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which has been really well received in this century and has been on a lot of these lists that have kind of popped up as we've been kind of evaluating the books that have come out since 2000 periodically to drive engagement over the years. But I read this around the time it came out. It was really noted, especially for its more experimental form. And to be honest, I can't really remember a whole lot about this book. I remember it playing with form, but I don't remember a whole lot else. I definitely need to revisit it, though looking up my response from when I read it in 2016, which was years after it was published, so 6 years after it was published, I gave it 3 stars then, which again, subjective personal preference, but does also make me wonder if a lot of that initial reception was just how different the storytelling form was when it came out, which I definitely understand. When it's the kind of vanguard of something, there is a lot to that and a lot of recognition that should be given, but by the time I got to it, did I recognize it as kind of boundary pushing as it was? I don't know. Next, we have well-deserved blockbuster Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is also on the list of books that have made me cry in a potbelly. Listen, I spent a lot of time in potbelly in my 20s, and we're just gonna leave it at that, but I definitely cried in a potbelly reading this book. For those who don't know, this book is kind of memoir cultural criticism, but it is written through the lens of the author writing to his 15-year-old son, and so especially his experience as a Black man in America as he is watching his son enter the years of becoming a man, and also the way he knows that this country forces or will force him to be perceived as a man earlier than his time. It's just incredibly moving. Next, in a book where the author appears multiple times on the list, but I have only read the one, Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward. I did love this one. I don't remember a whole lot about it, but I do remember a ghost. And so it does have this speculative angle amidst this exploration of intergenerational trauma, both within a family unit and more generally amidst the kind of national and cultural landscape. And to my recollection, the voice was just also incredibly beautiful, which really I assume holds up based on the fact that Ward has multiple entries on this list. Now, I have read Americana by Chimamanda Adichie, but she has been actively engaging in and supporting trans exclusionary radical feminism talking points and rhetoric for at least the last couple of years now, to my view and understanding, and because of that, I'm just not interested in engaging with her work any further. Next, we have Atonement by Ian McEwan, which I, for some reason, thought was an older book than 2002, though that just may be because it has a film adaptation with Keira Knightley directed by Joe Wright, which I shamefully haven't seen as a lover of Keira Knightley historical movies directed by Joe Wright. I read this in the summer right after college, where I was trying to catch up on a lot of things, especially classics, and I remember not loving it. I'm sure the language was gorgeous because I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I just remember being really frustrated and reacting really negatively to the sister, which I know was the whole point of the book. I just remember finishing it and feeling the urge to reread Brideshead Revisited, which I probably need to do now anyway, because it's been so long since I read that book, but I don't honestly foresee myself revisiting Atonement. But now for what I would argue is my favorite book of the 21st century, coming in at 18 on the official list, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. And this is the George Saunders that I think deserves to be on the list. I mean, I love Saunders. I'm not begrudging him being on the list. I just think 3 times is a little excessive, and if we had to pick one, for me, it would be this one. Now, I know that part of the appeal and the kind of PR machine behind this book when it first came out, because I picked it up at Book Expo America in 2016, was that it is the first novel from short story writer George Saunders, and this idea of how his voice was going to translate to a novel. I'm only showing this because it's one of my prized possessions as someone who generally doesn't really care about arcs in the way I used to, but like this arc is special to me, which is why I bought the finished copy at Indie Bookstore Day last year, so I'd have another copy to reread because I worried about wearing that one out. But this has just about everything I love in a book, and I am basically an evangelist of this book. If you ask me in a bar what my favorite book is under pressure, I will probably say this book, but it has elements of historical fiction in that it takes place right after the death of President Lincoln's son. It has a liminal space in the graveyard where his son has been buried and the ghosts of the graveyard. It has elements of the dramatic in the way that it is written, though that is my one big critique of the book, is that in terms of the formatting, as someone who came up in the theater, I'm used to seeing the speaker, I know this is going to throw off the white balance, seeing the speaker come before the text, because then as a reader you have a sense of who is speaking. Here it comes after, which can be a kind of misdirection sometimes. It was definitely something I had to get used to, but this book is just so inventive, fun, funny, and profound at the same time. It's inventive in terms of its storytelling. It is a quick, engrossing read at the end of the day because it does move very quickly, and there's just a lot of emotional punch to it. And if we're talking about, you know, experimental forms, I think that this definitely qualifies. Sure, some of the speech stuff falls more into the more theatrical, but it's also kind of framed by these kind of breakaways of the historical record, especially like differing accounts within the historical record, and really exploring this idea of our stories and our memories and how things get perpetuated, how stories get told, and what our legacy is. It's just beautiful. I love it. I need to reread it again soon. When I'm having a bad day or just need a pick-me-up, sometimes I will go back to specific passages in this book occasionally, or just flip through it, because it is something that you can kind of jump in and out of to a certain extent. But I just absolutely adore that book, and if for some reason you have not read this book yet, let this be your sign to check out that book. Next, I have read The Sellout by Paul Beatty, which I did unhaul a year or 2 ago just because I didn't foresee myself rereading it, while also acknowledging that it was an important book, and here we see further evidence of that. It is a satirical look at racism in America, but it really pushes things to the extreme in a way that does just really work within the book. I don't know how to fully explain it, especially having been years out from reading it, but it is definitely something you just kind of need to read and experience. And then coming in at number 7 a book I was so excited to see on this list, especially so high on this list, in a position that it absolutely deserves. The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, which is a speculative historical fiction that imagines if the Underground Railroad were a real Underground Railroad. I do know that there is a show version of this that I have not watched yet. I do need to reread the book and I need to watch the show. I think at the time, I think it premiered on Amazon Prime at a time that I was not watching Prime at all, and even still a lot of the shows that I have talked about and reviewed that are on Amazon Prime I've watched because I've gotten a free trial. But either way, I absolutely adore this book. It's weird, like I said, it's speculative, but it still taps into the real historical elements, and it uses the speculative elements to really heighten the realities of the history at the time. The language is gorgeous, as it has been across all of Colson Whitehead's work that I've read. I loved this book. I absolutely need to reread it. I do not know why I do not own a copy of this book, but this is absolutely a book that I think deserves a spot on this list. Honestly, it could deserve to be higher on this list, in my opinion. I think that this was just so inventive, especially at the time, while engaging with important ideas and commentary within this really emotionally moving framework. And it has some really striking imagery that it conjures, which I don't think can be understated how impressive that is in a book. So I absolutely love this book, and I definitely need to revisit. And then at number 3, we have Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. So we will kind of bookend this in that the last book that I have read from the list is from the same series as the first book that I have read from the list. So that worked out in kind of beautiful symmetry. But again, Wolf Hall is interesting that this is so high in comparison to Bring Up the Bodies. And it might be just that this book did it first, and so it's the first time we saw this, especially the linguistic stylings, like I said, with that extreme third person executed. I do maintain that for me as a reader, I think it was perfected in the second book, but I think there's a lot to be said about the inventiveness of this book, the fact that we are viewing pretty familiar history in a lot of ways from such a unique perspective, and that is putting us into rooms within a historical fiction setting that I personally, as a reader, was not or had not been in before. And the simple fact that it was drawing out Cromwell as such a complex and sympathetic character when we know the Cromwell of the historical record as well. I think that there was a lot interesting going on in that as well. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because we already talked about this series pretty in depth when we talked about Bring Up the Bodies, but there we go. Now, I will say, I mentioned Trust as a book that I own that is on the list that I have not yet read, and I do have 2 more. Fun Home I have owned for I think a bajillion years and somehow have just not read, which is absurd, right? Because it is a graphic novel. It would be such a quick read, and there is a musical version of this graphic novel. Why I have not read this, I do not know. I cannot explain it either, but I've kept it for so many years. Another book that I need to read, Clad Atlas by David Mitchell, which is an autographed copy that I think someone picked up for me when he was in the store. I actually used a gift card on this that I won for being like employee of the month. That may give away what bookstore I used to work at in a way that I have really avoided, but you know what? It's been a lot of years. Anyway, I read The Bone Clocks. I want to be clear that I have read The Bone Clocks. I read The Bone Clocks and Station 11 very close together, and I adore The Bone Clocks. So I don't know why I haven't read Cloud Atlas yet, especially when I've seen the trailer for the movie, which I also haven't watched because I told myself I can't watch it until I've read the book. And 1, Ben Whishaw is in it, and I really enjoy Ben Whishaw as an actor, but 2, I loved the trailer. So I already have the sense based on that trailer that the inventiveness of The Bone Clocks is also evident here, especially as The Bone Clocks is something where the kind of odd is happening off screen, for lack of a better term, for so much of that book. We just get the sense that there's something weird going on in the periphery, which we see a little bit more front and center in Slade House. So I'm familiar with Mitchell's work. I need to read this book. Now, I won't take too long because I know I'd spent a lot of time talking about the books that I have read on the list. Can you imagine if I tried to talk about the entire list more generally? However, I do want to mention some omissions from the list that I noticed, or things that I was a little surprised not to see in whatever form, or things that I personally think are worthy to be on this list, and I would be very interested to know what your additions would be as well. Now, the first really big omission I noticed was Lauren Groff. I personally would give her spot to Matrix, her first historical fiction. However, I am realistic and know that more generally it would probably go to Fates and Furies, her blockbuster novel that looked at the kind of breakdown of a marriage through their distinct points of view and was amazing, and is on my smaller list of books that specifically mention a dramaturg. A Little Life is also on that list, as well as Leia on the Offbeat. I feel like there's another one, but I've forgotten it. However, regardless of what slot that would go to, I was shocked to not see it on the list at all. Additionally, from the same reading era, I want to say it came out the same year as The Underground Railroad, and really knocked me off my feet in that same time, Homegoing by Ya Jesse, I was really shocked to not see here, especially if we're talking about experimentation of form. The way that that is a novel that moves us through generations, through short stories, and looking at this family through different generations and the short stories that kind of pull us in and out of these people's lives. And I'm saying this as someone who doesn't generally enjoy intergenerational explorations, but I do enjoy short stories. And this book is just so good and has been well received, and to my knowledge continues to be well received. So I really was kind of shocked not to see it on this list. Another kind of omission that did shock me was there was no Sally Rooney. This mostly because she has been touted by the media to a large extent as the literary voice of the millennial generation. While she has been incredibly popular and well received, that mantle was kind of thrust upon her. And so I really was shocked to not see her at all on this list, especially as she does have a very distinctive voice as well. I would expect if she was on this list for it to go to normal people, because that is my personal favorite, and I just do think it is the strongest of her canon, at least at this point. I guess we'll see what we get with Intermezzo, but again, I was a little surprised to not see her at all, even if I do know her lack of quotation marks can be divisive. I was also surprised not to see any Celeste Ng, though I have not read her most recent release, Our Missing Hearts, which I know isn't really recent anymore, and I know Little Fires Everywhere was a blockbuster hit, being picked up by Reese Witherspoon into an adaptation, but I actually would have given it to Everything I Never Told You, which was a just really heart-wrenching domestic exploration of a family after the loss of the daughter of that family. And it took a lot of elements and tropes that I didn't think I really liked as a reader. I know, common kind of reoccurring theme here, and just really struck a chord with me. And I thought it was a really beautiful novel and a really beautiful debut. So I was a little surprised because I feel like that work was really well received, and I was a little surprised not to see it on here. I guess maybe it just isn't as much of a standout in comparison. I don't know, but there are a lot of books that have continued to stay with me that I was thinking about for these slots as well. Now, for some that are probably just more personal picks, but I do think a case could be made for their inclusion on the list. One, would it be a video on my channel if I did not talk about Mariana Enriquez when given the opportunity? No. So I do think that there was an opportunity to put particularly Things We Lost in the Fire on this list, especially as that collection really balances political and personal horrors of Argentina in a really delightful and dark way. I think it's a really excellent collection that is smart and searing, as I have said again and again, but I do think it is an incredibly important work that may just need to be a little bit more widely picked up. In the same vein of short stories, if we were to get rid of one of George Saunders' entries, we could potentially slot something like Mariana Enriquez or Kelly Link, particularly Get in Trouble, into that slot, because both are very weird experimental short stories. I think Get in Trouble is probably going to appeal a little bit more to those who are more in line with George Saunders' work. It's a little bit more long form. Its flavor of odd is a little bit more closely aligned, but Get in Trouble continues to be one of my favorite short story collections, and I think it is a really successful short story collection, and I would have loved to see it included on this list. I was also kind of shocked in some ways to not see All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr on the list. I know that there has been an adaptation of that recently I have not seen, but that was such a blockbuster hit that year, and hopefully I'm not blending my years here, was either All the Light We Cannot See or The Girl on the Train, and trying to find those read-alikes. I do think The Nightingale kind of popped in there as well, but maybe how much of a blockbuster hit All the Light We Cannot See was working against it, or it was seen as too popular or like mass appealing. I don't know. I felt like that book was really well received and it received a lot of awards, so I'm actually kind of surprised not to see it on this list. And to a large extent, a lot of like the kind of literary trends that have kind of come throughout the century so far, especially in the period from like 2010 to now, aren't as represented on this list as you would expect. So it's kind of showing what parts of literature we're pulling from in some ways. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it's a really interesting reflection in some ways as well. Now, another book that kind of transcends genres and genre that I definitely could have seen included on this list and was very big at the time it came out and continues to be is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Now, I know that this is a book that you kind of either love or you hate, but this came out when I was in college. What year did this officially come out? 2012. 2011 or 2012. I was looking at that page very quickly. And I can't understate how different book discovery was at the time. And this I heard about through word of mouth and online. Like, the buzz behind this book was real, and it is such a gorgeous, beautiful novel. Now, again, I recognize that it is for a very specific kind of reader, but to be fair, all of the books on this list are. And so yeah, I just would have loved to see these Dueling Magicians on the list. Now, there are also a couple of nonfiction entries that I was thinking about. Now, one is hard because the author is already on the list for The Warmth of Other Suns, which I admittedly have not read yet, but cast is also so important. So I'm going to trust that The Warmth of Other Suns, if we had to pick, is the one. But if we're giving doubles to other people, I do think it can't be understated how important the book cast is. And yeah, it's an important book. It's a well-constructed book. It's an interesting book, if also disturbing. I don't know. I don't know how much more to say about it, but I do think that it deserves at least a shout out. Additionally, I think that this kind of potentially the reason it wasn't here is that it veers more on pop culture, but Bad Blood by John Carreyrou was such a good book. And to know that it had, and his reporting had, a direct impact on the fall of Theranos and how important that investigation was, I think it is an incredibly important, is an incredibly important piece of journalism and investigative journalism. And it's also just a bonkers book. It's so interesting, it's so eye-opening, it's so disturbing, and also to know that it is his original reporting, I just think that it is an excellent book, and I could have seen it included on this list as well. But to be fair, there are a lot of books, even more books than this, that I could have seen included on this list, but I wanted to keep it somewhat concise here at the end, considering I have been babbling on here for a while now. But like I said earlier, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts about this list, both more generally, as well as what books you read and loved on the list. If there are books you read on the list that you did not enjoy, what you would have liked to see included, whatever thoughts may be percolating, I would love to hear them. But as always, thank you so much for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.